Hey guys, tonight we drift into the candlelit quiet of a small French town at the end of the 18th century, where a restless boy is already staring too hard at the pages of books he barely understands. You are going to follow him, and if you manage to stay awake through every dusty library shelf and ink-blotted scrap of paper, well, congratulations, you've survived what most people would call the ultimate endurance test. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The boy's name is Jean-François Champollion, and you can imagine him wandering through the narrow stone streets of Figeac, a little market town where clattering hooves on cobbles mingle with the faint smell of bread baking in hearth ovens. Born in 1790, in the middle of revolutionary upheaval, he is the youngest of 7 children. By the time he can string sentences together, the French Revolution has already carved its mark on his family's life. And yet, amid the constant talk of politics and war, his mind drifts elsewhere toward languages, toward strange letters he glimpses in old manuscripts, toward worlds long gone. He is, by all accounts, fidgety. Imagine him in a cramped classroom, his legs restless under the wooden desk, while his mind races far ahead of the teacher's voice. Where other children see a dull grammar exercise, Jean-François sees a code, a puzzle daring him to break it open. A cousin later remarked that the boy seemed possessed by letters, scribbling furiously on whatever scrap of parchment he could find. The smell of ink stains his fingertips, and the other boys tease him for spending afternoons with dusty books instead of playing outside. Yet this is the seed of what will one day blossom into the field of Egyptology. Historians still argue whether his early brilliance was fueled more by raw talent or by his brother's encouragement. But either way, Jean-François was already training himself for a lifetime of decoding. Imagine the quiet evenings when he'd sit by the dim glow of an oil lamp, tracing lines from a Latin text with his finger, mouthing words until they became familiar sounds. The hum of crickets outside, the occasional bark of a dog in the square, and inside, only the scratching of a pen and the slow breathing of a child who would not rest until he had solved the mystery before him. Of course, it wasn't just Latin that caught his attention. By the age of 10, Jean-François had begun dabbling in Greek, with its twisting letters that looked more like symbols than words. For a boy of such small means in a provincial town, this was unusual. Most of his peers might dream of the army, the priesthood, or perhaps following their fathers into trade. But he was consumed by the idea that the world was written down somewhere, waiting for him to unlock it. There is something both amusing and a little sad about a boy so young already shouldering that sense of destiny, as if he were convinced that ancient voices were whispering directly to him through the cracks of forgotten alphabets. And then there's the quirky part. Family accounts mention that Jean-François sometimes used to memorize whole passages backwards, as if to prove to himself that letters could be twisted, rearranged, and still make sense. It drove his tutors a little mad. Imagine being the schoolmaster who assigns a translation exercise only to have a small, stubborn boy return it flawlessly recited from memory, then cheekily repeat it in reverse. That stubborn streak, half brilliance and half mischief, would never leave him. You might wonder, why did languages hold him so tightly? Perhaps it was because language, unlike politics or fortune, couldn't be taken away. The revolution might sweep away kings and priests. Armies might march across borders, but the Greek alphabet would still be the Greek alphabet. And in those early years, when France itself seemed unstable, young Champollion grasped at the permanence of words carved in stone. The mainstream fact here is simple. By the time he was 11, Champollion had already begun serious study of Hebrew, Syriac, and later Arabic. That's right, while most children his age were still stumbling over French grammar. He was exploring languages of the Near East. This placed him far ahead of his time, because the late 18th century in France was a period when Oriental studies were just beginning to gain academic prestige. To stumble across a provincial boy so dedicated to them was, for scholars, a shock. Still, not everyone was impressed. Historians still argue whether his early exposure to so many languages truly set him apart, or whether it was simply a reflection of his obsessive nature. After all, plenty of bright boys have devoured Latin or Greek at a young age. But not all of them become the father of Egyptology. Was he destined, or simply dogged? You get to decide as you imagine him there in Figeac, a wiry, restless figure with ink-stained fingers and eyes just a little too intense for his age. Picture him walking home through narrow alleys, past crumbling stone walls covered with moss, clutching a book under his arm as if it were treasure. Other children laugh, chase each other, play in the muddy street, but Jean-François slips past them. He is polite but distant, already living more in the past than in the present. At home, he begs his elder brother Jacques-Joseph to find him more texts, more dictionaries, more guides to languages he cannot yet pronounce. And Jacques, sensing the spark, encourages him. This family bond will matter later, when the world begins to doubt him. If you tilt your imagination, you can almost hear the soundscape of his evenings. The crackle of firewood, the ticking of a clock, the murmur of siblings in another room. He sits hunched, repeating phrases under his breath until they blur into a sleepy chant. His eyelids grow heavy, yet his fingers still trace the same line of script again and again, as if willing the ancient voices to speak through him. In that quiet little house in Figeac, the first foundations of a world-changing decipherment are being laid. Quirky side note: one relative later joked that the boy seemed so obsessed with letters that he might even try to decipher the pattern of cracks in the kitchen tiles. And honestly, you can picture the child staring at random shapes, convinced they must hide some deeper meaning. That mindset, bordering on the eccentric, would serve him well when he later confronted the baffling shapes of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The provincial world around him is small, almost suffocating. But for Jean-François, the words on a page are doorways to empires, temples, and deserts he has never seen. He doesn't know it yet, but the Rosetta Stone still lying in Egypt, not yet transported to London, will one day fall into his intellectual path. For now, he is only a boy, restless and hungry, burning with questions that make it hard to sleep. And maybe that's the most relatable detail of all. A child lying awake, brain buzzing, staring into the dark with thoughts too large for his age. If you've ever had nights where your mind refused to quiet, you can understand the mood. He is already chasing whispers across centuries, already refusing to accept the silence of forgotten scripts. The story of Egypt's lost language hasn't even entered his life yet, but you can sense how ready he is. Every restless night in Figeac, every stubborn recitation, every smudge of ink on his hand is one step closer to a future moment. when the ancient carvings of pharaohs will finally give up their secrets. Jean-François might have remained just another clever provincial boy, if not for the steady presence of his older brother, Jacques Joseph. Imagine Jacques as a figure both stern and warm, guiding his much younger sibling with a mix of patience and urgency that only an elder brother can carry. Jacques was not a scholar of languages himself, but he saw something blazing in Jean-François, something unusual, maybe even dangerous, in its intensity. While the rest of the family worried about survival in post-revolutionary France, Jacques made a quiet decision. He would nurture this boy's mind, no matter the cost. You picture Jacques walking through the narrow lanes of Grenoble, a folder of borrowed manuscripts tucked under his arm, muttering to himself about how expensive these books were and how ungrateful his little brother might turn out. Yet he still brings them home, still sets them down in front of Jean-François with a kind of theatrical flourish, as if presenting treasure from some distant bazaar. And the boy, wide-eyed, devours every page like a starving man at a feast. The bond between them grows in those moments, the steady provider and the insatiable reader. Jacques himself had trained in law, drifting into public service, and he understood just enough about the scholarly world to sense its walls and gates. He knew his brother's passion could not thrive in the small-town atmosphere of Figuig. Too many neighbors saw Jean-François as eccentric, maybe even foolish, wasting his time with squiggles and alphabets, while real men learned trade or prepared for military service. So Jacques slowly begins plotting, like a quiet strategist, how to get this boy into a bigger world, how to connect him with mentors who won't laugh at his obsessions. By the time Jean-François reaches his teens, Jacques has become both surrogate father and conspirator. Their own father had been distant and, by some accounts, not much inclined toward intellectual life. It was Jacques who shielded Jean-François from discouragement, who explained to skeptical relatives that yes, there was value in studying Arabic verbs, even if it didn't make obvious sense in a landlocked French town. He kept the boy's fire from being snuffed out by provincial boredom. Mainstream fact here. In 1802, when Jean-François was only 12, Jacques brought him to Grenoble. It was a turning point. Grenoble had libraries, teachers, and a small circle of scholars fascinated by the Orient. It wasn't Paris, but it was infinitely richer in opportunity than Figuig. For the boy, arriving there must have felt like stepping from a cramped cottage into a cathedral of knowledge. The streets bustled with uniforms, professors, merchants, and the low hum of post-revolutionary France still searching for its balance. And in the middle of it, a wiry child, barely tall enough to carry the books he begged for. In Grenoble, Jacques arranged lessons with local Orientalists, especially Father Abel, a teacher who recognized in Jean-François not just diligence but genius. Historians still argue whether Jacques' decision to bring his brother so young was reckless after all. Jean-François' health was fragile, and he missed the ordinary warmth of family life. But what is clear is that without Jacques' intervention, the boy might never have had access to the resources that set him on his path. Imagine evenings in Grenoble, Jacques poring over civic paperwork, weary from bureaucratic duties, while Jean-François mutters Arabic phrases aloud. Filling the small apartment with strange cadences, Jacques tolerates it, even when neighbors complain about the noise. He smiles, perhaps a little grimly, knowing his own career will never shake the world, but his brother's might. The quirky tidbit here is that Jacques often bribed his brother with food to take breaks. Letters mention that Jean-François would skip meals for entire days, lost in study, until Jacques forced bread or cheese into his hands. One can almost see it. The older brother holding out a crust, snapping his fingers, insisting, "Eat this before you faint over your hieroglyphs that no one even understands." The boy would chew absent-mindedly, eyes still glued to the parchment, crumbs scattering on the pages. But Jacques wasn't just a provider. He also carefully built his brother's reputation. He showed his essays to local professors, insisted on having him present at small gatherings, and subtly spread the word that there was a prodigy in Grenoble worth paying attention to. At times, Jean-François resisted. He was shy, awkward, and not at all comfortable in polite society. Yet Jacques understood the rules of advancement better than his brother did. If you want recognition, you must be seen. And if you must be seen, someone has to manage the introductions. There is something deeply touching about this partnership. Imagine the dim lamplight of their shared rooms. One brother coughing over civic reports, the other chanting verbs and scribbling notes until ink blots covered his fingers. The sound of quills scratching, the faint smell of wax candles burning low, and the quiet rhythm of two lives intertwined, one sacrificing comfort, the other driven toward a destiny neither fully comprehended yet. And here's the scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether Jacques pushed his brother too hard. Did his constant encouragement drive Jean-François into a life of obsession that wrecked his health, or did it save him from obscurity? The line is thin between nurture and pressure. But in retrospect, the world received from this relationship something monumental. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, so perhaps the sacrifices were worth it. Grenoble itself became a playground of opportunity. Its libraries contained volumes on Coptic, a language considered obscure and marginal by most scholars. But Jacques ensured his brother had access to them. Coptic would later become the bridge between ancient Egypt and modern understanding. Without Jacques quietly securing those resources, who knows if Jean-François would have stumbled onto the insight that cracked the hieroglyphic code. Imagine Jacques sitting his brother down one evening, saying in a half-joking tone, "Little one, if you must ruin your eyes with books, at least ruin them with books that matter." He hands him a text in Coptic, its strange script flowing across the page. The boy takes it reverently, as if holding a secret key, and whispers to himself, This feels closer." And in that dimly lit room, with bread crusts scattered on the table and wax dripping from a guttering candle, the pieces begin to fall into place, not yet fully, not yet dramatically, but slowly, like a long game of patience, where every card laid down inches you toward victory. The story of Champollion cannot be told without Jacques-Joseph, the brother who saw a spark and refused to let it flicker out. Without him, Jean-François might have been just another restless boy scribbling in the margins of his schoolbooks. Instead, he was position-fed, funded, and emotionally armored for a future that would one day shake the academic world. Napoleon had a way of turning entire nations into stages for his ambitions, and Egypt was one of his grandest performances. In 1798, when Jean-François Champollion was still only 8 years old, French forces landed on Egyptian soil, banners whipping in the desert wind. The campaign itself was military and political, but it had a second, quieter purpose: to study. Napoleon brought with him a small army of scholars, artists, engineers, and linguists who carefully documented the monuments, flora, fauna, and customs of Egypt. Imagine French officers sketching obelisks while cannons rumbled in the distance. It was equal parts invasion and scientific expedition. It was in this context that the Rosetta Stone first surfaced. In 1799, French soldiers, while strengthening a fort near the Nile Delta town of Rashid, Rosetta to Europeans, uncovered a dark slab of granodiorite, covered with 3 parallel inscriptions. They had no idea that this chunk of stone, barely 4 feet high, would eventually change the way the world thought about one of the greatest civilizations. They simply noticed that the text was carved in 3 distinct scripts: Greek, Demotic, and a mysterious collection of little figures, hieroglyphs, that no one had been able to read for more than 1,000 years. Picture a sunburnt soldier brushing the sand from its face, blinking at the strange mixture of symbols. Perhaps, he muttered to himself, looks important. He wasn't wrong. Soon after, the scholars attached to Napoleon's expedition realized its potential. If the Greek could be read, and, of course, Greek was well known, then perhaps the other 2 scripts might also yield their secrets. That simple logic would spark decades of rivalry, patience, and sleepless nights. But here's the ironic twist. The French didn't get to keep the stone. After Napoleon's forces surrendered to the British in 1801, the Rosetta Stone became war booty. It was shipped to London and placed in the British Museum, where it still rests today. You can almost feel the quiet bitterness of French scholars who had glimpsed this treasure, and then watched it slip into their rival's hands. And yet, the damager, rather, the inspiration, had already been done. News of the stone spread across Europe, sending waves of excitement through intellectual circles. Imagine small academic salons in Paris buzzing with whispered conversations. They found an inscription in 3 scripts. Think of it a bilingual or trilingual key to Egypt. Scholars who had long dreamed of unlocking the mystery of hieroglyphs suddenly sensed that the prize was within reach. Mainstream fact here: the first scholarly publication of the stone's text was made by French savants in 1802 in the monumental description D.L. Egypt, Napoleon's encyclopedic project cataloguing all things Egyptian. Even though Britain physically held the stone, France had its copies. And it was these copies, drawings, transcriptions, circulated impressions, that eventually reached the eager hands of young Champollion. But before he laid eyes on those precious texts, the Egyptian fever was already sweeping through France. Jacques, always with an eye on opportunities, exposed Jean-François to this craze. Imagine the boy overhearing excited debates in Grenoble's salons about pyramids, mummies, and strange obelisks. Egypt had become fashionable. Wealthy families decorated their drawing rooms with sphinx-shaped furniture and sold coffee under hieroglyph-like logos. It was kitsch and scholarship blended together, but for Jean-François it was an irresistible magnet. Quirky tidbit: some Parisians even started wearing jewelry shaped like miniature obelisks, convinced it would bring them wisdom. One satirical newspaper joked that if the trend continued, every shopkeeper would soon be dressed like a pharaoh. Imagine Jean-François grinning at this from afar, thinking, let them wear their silly amulets, I will understand the real Egypt. The scholarly world, however, was not all giddy fashion. Historians still argue whether the British Museum's control of the stone helped or hindered the decipherment. On one hand, it ensured stability. The stone was safe, preserved, and widely available to visiting scholars. On the other hand, French pride was wounded, and many in Paris felt robbed of their rightful discovery. The rivalry between nations became entangled with the rivalry between scholars and academic drama layered on top of political enmity. Now imagine Jean-François, still in his early teens, leaning over reproductions of the Rosetta inscriptions. He cannot yet grasp their significance, but he senses something calling. His brother Jacques whispers, "This, little one, may be the riddle of your lifetime." And the boy, restless as ever, begins filing the information away in the corners of his mind. The idea that somewhere in these strange symbols lay the voices of ancient kings and priests was almost too much to resist. Grenoble's libraries offered more fuel. The description d'Egypte volumes began circulating, with their lavish engravings of temples, sphinxes, and hieroglyphic walls. For most readers, they were simply beautiful pictures. For Jean-François, they were challenges. He stared at the symbols, repeating them silently, sketching them into his notebooks until the shapes became familiar, even if their meanings remained locked. His schoolmates teased him. Why waste your time drawing birds and squiggles? But he ignored them. He knew that somewhere in those squiggles was a code waiting for him. This was also the age when European imagination went wild about Egypt. Poets described pyramids as gateways to eternity, and philosophers mused that all wisdom flowed from the Nile. At times, the exaggeration bordered on the absurd. One fringe pamphlet even claimed that Egyptians had invented hot air balloons centuries before France. Jean-François, practical and sharp, probably rolled his eyes at such nonsense. Yet even the wildest myths added to the aura of mystery that surrounded the Rosetta Stone. Picture him one evening in Grenoble, the candlelight catching the curve of his ink-stained cheek, while outside the snow falls softly against the windows. He copies hieroglyphic symbols onto a scrap of paper, then glances at the parallel Greek text printed beside them. He cannot yet bridge the gap, but he feels the thrill of a hunter who has found fresh tracks in the forest. The prey is still distant, but it is real. The Rosetta Stone was more than a slab. It was a promise. A promise that the silence of Egypt's temples could be broken, that the carved walls of Luxor and Karnak might one day speak again. And for a boy who already lived half in the past, that promise was irresistible. Jean-François did not yet know how many rivals he would have, nor how many years of exhaustion lay ahead. For now, he was simply intoxicated by the idea that an entire civilization's voice was within reach. And somewhere in his notebooks, he scribbled little lines of hieroglyphs, perhaps whispering to himself, "One day, I'll hear what you're saying." In Grenoble, Jean-François began to shine in a way that even seasoned teachers found unnerving. You have to imagine this wiry, sharp-eyed teenager sitting in classrooms where most pupils groaned over declensions, while he leaned forward, hungry, impatient, almost vibrating with questions. He wasn't the kind of student who simply memorized. He wanted to dismantle languages, take them apart like gears in a clock, and then rebuild them. His notebooks filled up with word lists, scribbles, and speculative comparisons between alphabets that his classmates had never even heard of. By the age of 15, he was already being whispered about as a prodigy. Grenoble's modest scholarly community started passing around anecdotes. The boy who speaks Greek as if he were born to it, or the one who translates Syriac for amusement. To an outsider, it might sound exaggerated, but the evidence was there. Teachers reported that Jean-François mastered Hebrew so quickly that he moved on to Arabic without waiting for the course to finish. He skipped levels the way other boys skipped stones across a river lightly, playfully, but with uncanny accuracy. Mainstream fact here. By 1807, at only 17 years old, Champollion presented a paper to Grenoble's Academy describing Coptic, the language he was beginning to see as the last descendant of ancient Egyptian. Think about that for a moment. 17. While his peers worried about military service or family trades, he was already lecturing scholars decades older than him. One of the professors later admitted that it was almost frightening to watch someone so young speak with such authority. Of course, being called a genius was not always comfortable. Jean-François was awkward in company. His speech could tumble out too fast, his eyes darting as though his thoughts ran ahead of his words. Social grace didn't matter to him, only the puzzle did. At dinners or small gatherings, he often sat quietly until someone mentioned Egypt or languages, and then he would erupt into excited commentary, leaving everyone else blinking in his wake. His obsession with languages gave rise to some endearing quirks. He carried scraps of paper in his coat so he could jot down comparisons between alphabets whenever inspiration struck. Once, he was spotted scribbling furiously during a church service, muttering about Coptic verb forms while the priest gave a sermon. The parishioners frowned, but Shock, sitting nearby, simply sighed and let his brother be. After all, what harm could come from a boy lost in scribbles? The quirky tidbit here: Jean-François developed the habit of pacing when he studied. He would walk back and forth across the room, reciting vocabulary aloud, waving his arms as though conducting an invisible orchestra of words. Neighbors thought him eccentric. One even complained that the mad boy disturbed their sleep with midnight chanting. Jack defended him, insisting that the noise was the sound of discovery. Grenoble, though provincial compared to Paris, provided the stage for his transformation. The libraries gave him access to rare volumes, and sympathetic teachers fed his hunger. Father Abel, the professor who first introduced him to Coptic, treated him not as a child but as a colleague. He encouraged Jean-François to pursue original research rather than simply mastering existing grammars. That encouragement was dangerous, because it convinced the boy that he could leap beyond the established authorities of the day. Historians still argue whether this early confidence made him reckless later. Some suggest that without years of humility under older scholars, he developed a combative streak that earned him enemies in Paris. Others argue that this boldness was precisely what allowed him to challenge centuries of wrong assumptions about hieroglyphs. Either way, Grenoble gave him a taste of independence that shaped his entire career. Picture the rhythm of his days: mornings in class, afternoons buried in the library, evenings hunched over a flickering candle with a quill scratching across parchment. The smell of wax, the dryness of old leather bindings, the dust that clung to his sleeves as he pulled volumes from high shelves. He read until his eyes blurred, then leaned close to the page, whispering words as though by speaking them he could conjure the ancients themselves. By now, the Rosetta Stone had entered scholarly rumor. Copies of the inscriptions began circulating through France, sometimes crude, sometimes precise. When Jean-François first glimpsed those hieroglyphic signs in print, he felt something stir. The bird shapes, the seated figures, the zigzag lines, they weren't random decorations. He was certain of it. He sketched them into his notebooks, repeating them like talismans. Other students laughed. Those are just little pictures. But to him, they were living syllables waiting for resurrection. He also began to argue quietly, at first, more boldly, later that Coptic was the key. This was not a mainstream view. Many scholars dismissed Coptic as a degenerate dialect, irrelevant to the grandeur of the pharaohs. But Jean-François saw continuity. He noticed words, roots, and patterns that echoed what little was guessed about Egyptian inscriptions. His conviction hardened. If one wanted to unlock hieroglyphs, one had to study Coptic deeply. Grenoble society found him fascinating and exasperating in equal measure. Mothers nudged their sons to be more like the Champollion boy, while fathers grumbled that he was wasting his youth. Jacques played diplomat, smoothing ruffled feathers, praising his brother's work, and quietly arranging introductions. Without Jacques, the fragile network of support might have collapsed under gossip and envy. And still, Jean-François pressed on. He began drafting his first serious writings, pouring youthful certainty into arguments about the value of Oriental languages. His handwriting sprawled across page after page, blotched and hurried, but his meaning clear. Egypt's voice was not lost, it was hidden. The Rosetta Stone was not a curiosity, was a key. And he, still a teenager in a provincial town, intended to use it. Quirky footnote. One contemporary recalled that when asked what he wanted for his birthday, Jean-François replied simply, "Another alphabet." It sounds like a joke, but given his obsession, you can believe it. The boy from Figeac was no longer simply restless. In Grenoble, under the guiding hand of his brother and the stirrings of Napoleonic Egyptomania, he had become something else, a focused instrument tuned for a single task. The Rosetta Stone waited far away in London. The scholars of Europe buzzed with speculation. And here, in the quiet French Alps, a teenager sharpened his mind like a blade. Paris, the very name carried both promise and peril for a provincial boy like Jean-François Champollion. By the time he moved there, his reputation as a prodigy had already trickled into scholarly circles, thanks largely to Jacques' tireless promotion. But arriving in the capital was like stepping into a roaring furnace of intellect and ambition. You can picture the streets alive with clattering carriages, newspaper criers shouting headlines about Napoleon's latest maneuvers, an endless filled with sharp-tongued students arguing about everything from philosophy to bread prices. For a boy from Figeac by way of Grenoble, Paris was overwhelming. Jacques accompanied him, of course, acting as guide, guardian, and publicist. He introduced his younger brother to academics, slipped his essays into the right hands, and spoke of him with a mixture of pride and protective anxiety. Yet the capital was not easily impressed. For every kind professor, there were 3 skeptical ones, ready to dismiss the provincial youth, as overeager Jean-François had to prove himself all over again. Mainstream fact here. In 1807, Champollion entered the de France, where he studied under the great Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy. De Sacy was a towering figure in Oriental studies, famed for his mastery of Arabic and Persian. For a young student, being in his classroom was both exhilarating and terrifying. Imagine a professor whose every raised eyebrow could either validate your work or crush it. De Sacy reportedly recognized Jean-François' talent, but remained cautious, advising patience and methodical discipline. Patience, however, was not exactly the boy's strongest trait. Jean-François dove into Arabic, Persian, and Coptic with even greater fervor. He wrote letters back to Grenoble filled with pride and exhaustion, describing nights where he studied until dawn, unable to sleep with so many alphabets whirling in his head. Yet, beneath the excitement lurked something else, a fragile body struggling to keep up. He suffered from fevers, headaches, and fainting spells, all of which worried Jacques. but try telling a determined teenager to rest. He brushed off illness as an inconvenience, a mere side effect of the race he felt he had to win. The quirky tidbit here, Champollion developed a reputation among fellow students for carrying his books in an oversized coat, so stuffed with dictionaries and notebooks that he looked lopsided when he walked. Some even nicknamed him the Walking Library. He didn't mind. In fact, he leaned into the image, striding into lecture halls with his pockets bulging, ready to spill out texts in half a dozen languages. But Paris was not only classrooms and libraries. It was also competition. Other young scholars, many with better connections, eyed him with suspicion. Who was this pale, wiry youth from the provinces daring to speak with such authority about Coptic and hieroglyphs? Historians still argue whether his sometimes combative personality, his tendency to snap when contradicted, earned him unnecessary enemies. What is clear is that he was no diplomat. His tongue was as sharp as his pen, and while that courage allowed him to challenge accepted dogma, it also painted a target on his back. The Rosetta Stone was now a subject of heated discussion in the capital. Drawings of the inscriptions circulated in scholarly circles, and rival theories emerged. Some insisted hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, representing abstract ideas rather than sounds. Others thought they were part of some mystical system, closer to alchemy than to language. Jean-François listened, frowned, and scribbled counter-arguments in his notebooks. To him, the symbols were word sound, unit sound, Coptic was the bridge. But as a teenager surrounded by older, established men, he often found his opinions dismissed as naive. Imagine him standing awkwardly at a gathering in a professor's drawing room. Scholars in powdered wigs sip wine, gesturing dramatically as they debate whether the Rosetta Stone will ever yield its secrets. Jean-François finally interrupts, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier. Coptic is the key. You are looking everywhere else, but not at the living descendant of the language itself. Silence falls, followed by polite coughs and thin smiles. Some dismiss him outright. Others raise eyebrows, intrigued but unconvinced. Jacques, standing nearby, beams with pride, yet braces himself for backlash. The atmosphere of Paris demanded resilience. Students with less grit might have shrunk under the pressure, but Champollion doubled down. He attended lectures by de Sacy, pestered other Orientalists with questions, and copied hieroglyphic inscriptions late into the night. When money ran short, Jacques hustled to find small stipends, scraping together enough to keep his brother afloat. Their rooms were modest, their meals often plain, but Jean-François hardly noticed. His real nourishment came from words, and Paris gave him plenty of them. Historians still argue whether his Paris years were more about learning or about stubbornly solidifying views he already held. What cannot be denied is that the city refined him. His grammar sharpened, his Coptic deepened, and his obsession crystallized. He was no longer simply a boy fascinated by alphabets. He was a man who believed he was destined to unlock the riddle of Egypt. Quirky anecdote. Once, during a lecture, de Sacy asked him a question about an obscure Arabic root. Jean-François, nervous, rattled off not just the answer, but several related forms, complete with cross-references to Coptic parallels. The room fell silent, then erupted in laughter, not mocking, but astonished. Even de Sacy is said to have chuckled, muttering, "Well, the boy has eaten the dictionaries." But brilliance was not enough. He also needed recognition, and Paris was slow to give it. He published small essays, delivered talks, and cultivated allies. But the academic establishment was cautious. Here was a provincial upstart with big claims and fragile health. Could he truly deliver? That skepticism haunted him and drove him harder. At night, in their small apartment, Jacques often found his brother slumped over a desk, candle burnt down to a puddle of wax, ink smeared across his cheek where he had dozed against the page. He would shake him awake, scold him gently, and press him toward bed. But even half asleep, Jean-François murmured about Coptic verbs and hieroglyphic birds, as though his dreams and studies had merged. So Paris became both a crucible and a proving ground. It gave him teachers, rivals, exhaustion, and fuel. It also gave him the stage upon which his lifelong drama with the Rosetta Stone would play out. In the bustling, skeptical, glittering capital, the restless boy of Figuiard hardened into a young man who refused to bow, convinced that one day the walls of ancient temples would speak again through him. The Rosetta Stone itself was, in one sense, deceptively plain. A dark, broken slab with 3 blocks of text. But for the young Champollion in Paris, it was a thunderclap. He knew enough Greek to read the bottom portion, and like everyone else, he quickly realized that the Greek inscription was a decree praising Ptolemy V, a young king of Egypt in the 2nd century BC. That much was straightforward. The riddle lay above it 2 other texts, one in flowing demotic script, the other in the strange pictorial hieroglyphs. To visualize it, imagine 3 parallel windows stacked on top of one another. The lowest, in Greek, is crystal clear clean panes of glass, through which the words shine. The middle window, demotic, is murkier curves and squiggles, rushed and almost shorthand. The top window, hieroglyphic, is dazzling but opaque little owls, seated men, zigzags, suns, and snakes, all lined up like a parade of symbols. 3 versions of the same decree, 3 voices speaking the same message, yet only one of them easily understood. Mainstream fact here. The 3 scripts on the Rosetta Stone represent different layers of Egyptian society. Greek was the language of administration. Demotic was the everyday script for common documents, and hieroglyphs were the sacred and ceremonial script. To scholars, this was thrilling. It suggested that if the same words appeared in all 3, a line-by-line comparison might yield the key. The trouble, of course, was that no one could agree on how hieroglyphs actually worked. Some insisted they were purely symbolic, each image representing a concept rather than a sound. Others believed they were mystical emblems, not meant to be read but only to convey sacred aura. A few radicals argued they might actually spell sounds like an alphabet, but such a suggestion was often scoffed at. Historians still argue whether these entrenched assumptions delayed the decipherment by decades. What is certain is that Champollion, stubborn and sharp, began siding with the radicals. But demotic came first. The middle text looked like hurried cursive compared to the careful artwork of hieroglyphs. Scholars across Europe scrambled to match demotic words with their Greek equivalents. They made lists, scratched out guesses, and circulated letters filled with hopeful exclamations. Some progress was made, but it was patchy. Champollion, however, saw demotic not as a final goal but as a stepping stone. To him, it was a bridge between Greek clarity and hieroglyphic mystery. He began carefully compiling tables. Demotic signs matched to Greek names, demotic words compared to Coptic echoes. Imagine him at a rickety desk, candle burning low, flipping between volumes, Greek on one side, demotic reproductions on another, and a Coptic grammar propped open beside them. His pen darts across the page, producing long columns of possible correspondences. Sometimes he pauses, mutters aloud, scratches his head, and starts over. At times, his notes are filled with question marks and little exclamations of frustration. Other times, he circles a word with such excitement that the ink bleeds through the paper. Here, the quirky tidbit. Champollion often doodled little caricatures in the margins of his notes, tiny hieroglyphic birds wearing hats, or snakes with exaggerated frowns. It was his way of breaking the tension, poking fun at the very signs that resisted him. Later, scholars chuckled at these sketches, reminders that even geniuses had moments of mischief when staring too long at incomprehensible symbols. Meanwhile, across Europe, rival theories clashed. In London, Thomas Young, an English polymath, was already making strides with demotic, identifying names and spotting patterns. The French and British intellectual rivalry mirrored their nation's political rivalry. Each side wanted the glory of cracking the code first. Newspapers even hinted at the race to decipher Egypt, as if scholars were athletes sprinting toward a finish line. In Paris, Champollion felt the pressure. He was younger, less established, but he believed he had an advantage. His deep grounding in Coptic, where others treated it as an afterthought, he considered it essential. The ancient Egyptians hadn't disappeared overnight, he reasoned. Their tongue had flowed into later forms, preserved in the language of Christian Egyptians. If the hieroglyphs had any phonetic value, Coptic would help reveal it. But the Rosetta Stone mocked him with its complexity. 3 columns of text, yes but worn, incomplete, and difficult to align perfectly. Portions of the hieroglyphic inscription were chipped away, leaving frustrating gaps. Imagine him tracing the missing pieces with his finger, sighing in frustration, muttering, "If only the stone were whole." Jacques, ever supportive, reminded him that even broken tools could still open locked doors. Historians still argue whether Champollion's stubborn focus on Coptic blinded him at times to other methods. Yet, without that obsession, he might never have cracked the code. Where others saw lifeless symbols, he heard echoes of words. Where others saw barriers, he saw bridges. Now picture Paris, where students debated whether hieroglyphs could ever be read. One says they are pictures only, like emblems. Another shakes his head. No, there must be sounds hidden there. In the corner, Jean-François sits silently, lips pursed. Already convinced he is right, but too wary to reveal all. His brother nudges him. Patience, the time will come. The Rosetta Stone's triple script wasn't just an artifact, it was a battlefield. Scholars fought over it with pens instead of swords, but the rivalries were fierce. For Jean-François, still young and often ill, the stone was both a torment and a promise. He knew that if he could unravel its layers, he would not only solve a puzzle, but also resurrect a civilization. And so he bent closer to his papers, scratching notes by candlelight, driven by a conviction stronger than hunger, stronger than sleep. And in those moments, hunched over ink-stained sheets, the boy from Figuignau, a man quietly began positioning himself as the one who would finally coax the silent hieroglyphs to speak. By now, Jean-François Champollion was fully entangled with the Rosetta Stone's puzzle, and the first threads he chose to tug at were the ones that looked most familiar. The Greek text at the bottom was a gifted, clearly stated that the decree honored King Ptolemy V. This meant, in theory, that the demotic and the hieroglyphic sections must contain the same names, the same royal titles, and the same phrasing. If you could spot the king's name in demotic or hieroglyphs, you had a foothold. So imagine him, hunched at his desk, running his finger down the Greek lines until he found Ptolemy. He circled it with a thick blot of ink, then turned to the middle script, scanning for a repeated cluster of squiggles that might match. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to align the patterns. This was where the first sparks of genuine decipherment glimmered. Mainstream fact here: by comparing Greek proper names with their demotic equivalents, scholars began to see that demotic was not just symbolic, it carried phonetic value. Thomas Young in England had already noted this, identifying certain demotic signs as corresponding to specific sounds. Champollion, however, pushed further. He believed these phonetic elements might also exist in the hieroglyphs, not just in demotic. That leap, while risky, would ultimately prove correct. The process was mind-numbing. Imagine page after page filled with tables of possible correspondences, Greek letters lined up against demotic shapes, scribbled arrows connecting them, and endless question marks where uncertainty reigned. Late at night, Jean-François would lean back, rub his temples, and mutter that the stone was mocking him. At times, his brother Jacques found him dozing face down on the desk, cheek pressed to the paper, drool smearing carefully written columns. He would laugh softly, shake him awake, and steer him toward bed. Quirky tidbit: Champollion occasionally celebrated small victories with exaggerated flair. One evening, after matching a set of demotic symbols to the Greek name Alexandros, he leapt up, nearly knocking over the candle, and declared himself the master of Alexander. Jack raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, and muttered, "Try mastering your supper first." The joke broke the tension, but the thrill remained. Every confirmed match was like a rung in a ladder out of darkness. But demotic was only half the battle. The hieroglyphs above still stared down at him with their owl eyes and coiled snakes, silent and enigmatic. The prevailing view among older scholars was that hieroglyphs were purely symbolic. An owl meant wisdom, a sun disk meant divinity, and so forth. They believed it was an art of ideas, not sounds. Champollion disagreed. He pointed again and again to the Rosetta Stone. If demotic carried phonetic value and the hieroglyphs paralleled demotic, then surely they must also contain sounds. Historians still argue whether he was bold or reckless to cling so stubbornly to this belief. Many contemporaries mocked him for it. Some accused him of being a dreamer, chasing sounds in pictures where none existed. But Jean-François had his secret weapon. Coptic. He noticed that certain Coptic words seemed to echo the meanings suspected in the hieroglyphs. For example, a hieroglyph that looked like a mouth appeared in contexts where Coptic used ro for mouth. This was more than coincidence, he argued, was continuity. He began sketching hieroglyphs into his notebooks, labeling them with Coptic words, testing combinations like a chemist mixing reagents. Sometimes the results fizzled. Sometimes they exploded with meaning. He wrote to Jacques in a fever, "These are not merely sacred pictures. They are letters. They are words." Jacques, ever the practical brother, reminded him to eat his bread before declaring revolutions in scholarship. Meanwhile, in London, Thomas Young published cautious results, noting partial phonetic values in demotic and even tentatively identifying some hieroglyphs in royal names. The scholarly duel was on. The British press hailed Young as a genius, while French scholars rallied behind their own prodigy. The stone had become not just an artifact, but a weapon in a cultural rivalry between nations. Imagine Champollion's frustration reading Young's publications. He admired the Englishman's brilliance, but bristled at his hesitations. Young saw phonetics only in foreign names, believing native Egyptian words remained symbolic. Champollion wanted to go further. Phonetics, he argued, ran deeper, threading through the entire system. It was a radical stance, and it isolated him even among French colleagues. But isolation never frightened him. He had been the odd boy in Figeac, the eccentric in Grenoble, and the awkward youth in Paris. Being doubted was almost familiar company. Quirky detail. In his more playful moods, he referred to demotic as the shorthand of the people, and hieroglyphs as the priestly mask. He joked that his job was to rip off the mask and make the priests talk like common men. His students and friends chuckled. But the metaphor captured his conviction. Hieroglyphs were not mystical symbols, they were language. Picture him at work late into the night, surrounded by towers of books, ink stains on his cuffs, his face pale in the candlelight. He scribbles another table of comparisons, then leans back, grins faintly, and whispers, "Yes, you are speaking. You just don't know it yet." The 3 scripts of the Rosetta Stone were no longer static carvings. To him, they were voices, aligned but distorted, waiting to be tuned. Greek was the clear melody, demotic the hurried whisper, and hieroglyphs the majestic but muffled chorus. Jean-François believed he had found the first thread of sound in that chorus. He only had to keep tugging until the entire ancient song unraveled. By the time Jean-François Champollion was in his 20s, one idea had taken firm root in his mind and refused to let go. Coptic was the bridge, where others glanced at it as an obscure liturgical language of Egyptian Christians. He treated it like the lifeline to the past. He was convinced almost fanatically that Coptic carried within it the last heartbeat of ancient Egyptian speech, and that without it, the hieroglyphs would remain mute forever. Picture him in a cramped study, 3 or 4 books propped open at once. A Coptic grammar, a Greek lexicon, reproductions of hieroglyphs, and sheets of his own scrawled notes. He flips between them with restless energy, muttering aloud. The syllables of Coptic strange, clipped mesical from his tongue as he matches them against little carved owls and zigzag waterlines. For most scholars, these comparisons looked tenuous at best, but for Champollion they rang like clear echoes. Mainstream fact here, Coptic really was the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. Written in an adapted Greek alphabet with a few additional characters, it survived in the liturgy of Egypt's Christian communities long after hieroglyphs had vanished. Few in Europe bothered to study it seriously. Champollion's decision to master Coptic, even compiled his own dictionary, was what gave him the decisive advantage later. At one point, he boasted to a friend, "I know Coptic as well as I know French." It was hardly an exaggeration. The quirky tidbit here, he used to practice Coptic aloud, while walking the streets of Paris, whispering odd syllables to himself, like a man rehearsing lines for a play. Passers-by turned their heads, probably assuming he was mad. Children sometimes followed him for a block, laughing as he repeated Ro MPA key, like a conjurer reciting a spell. He didn't care. To him, every murmured word was a bridge plank laid between the present and the age of the pharaohs. Coptic was not just academic, it became personal. He dreamed in it, scribbled love letters with Coptic flourishes, and even scolded himself in Coptic phrases when he made mistakes. His notebooks show endless marginalia, little exclamations in Coptic script, sometimes circled, sometimes underlined twice. When Jacques teased him about it, he replied, "If the Egyptians spoke it for centuries, why shouldn't I?" The more he worked, the more patterns emerged. He noticed that certain hieroglyphs matched Coptic words directly. A hieroglyph that looked like a foot appeared in contexts where the Coptic word for to go or to walk occurred. A picture of a hand corresponded to the Coptic to give. These were not mystical symbols, they were language, alive and phonetic. Each discovery felt like a pulse of electricity running through him. But he wasn't alone in the race. In London, Thomas Young had also dabbled in Coptic, though not as obsessively. Young suspected connections, but never trusted them enough to push the idea to its extreme. Historians still argue whether Young would have eventually cracked the code if Champollion had not beaten him to it. But what no one disputes is that Champollion's total immersion in Coptic gave him a depth of insight that no rival could match. Of course, obsession has costs. His health, always fragile, began to suffer more visibly. He skipped meals, forgot to sleep, and occasionally collapsed from exhaustion. Jacques tried to intervene, pressing food into his hands or dragging him outside for fresh air. Once, after finding him unconscious at his desk, Jacques threatened to burn his notebooks if he didn't take better care of himself. Jean-François recovered quickly and promptly returned to work. Quirky detail. Champollion once quipped to a friend that, if anyone wanted to poison him, they should lace his Coptic grammar with arsenic. Since that was the only book he never put down, it was half a joke, half a chilling truth. His stubborn reliance on Coptic was not universally admired. Critics dismissed it as provincial fancy, arguing that the sacred hieroglyphs could not possibly share roots with the language of humble village priests. They preferred grand theories about mystical symbolism. To them, Champollion's work sounded almost insulting, dragging the sacred down into the realm of the everyday. But Jean-François held firm. He believed that the grandeur of Egypt was not diminished by being linguistic, it was deepened. The gods had spoken through syllables, not just through symbols. Historians still argue whether his near-religious attachment to Coptic blinded him to alternative approaches at times. Yet, ironically, it was this single-mindedness that let him keep hammering away where others hesitated. He trusted his instinct that the continuity of language mattered more than anyone had allowed. Picture him during one of his fevered nights. The candle nearly burnt out. Shadows of bookshelves, looming like temple pillars, his face pale but his eyes glowing. He jots down a string of hieroglyphs beside a Coptic word, pauses, then suddenly gasps. His heart races. He leaps up, pacing the room, muttering, "It fits, it fits." He grabs another sheet, repeats the process, and finds the same echo again. For hours he paces, scribbles, mutters, until finally he collapses in exhaustion. For him, these small breakthroughs weren't just academic triumphs. They were intimate conversations across millennia. He wasn't simply decoding. He was listening. Each Coptic match was like a whisper from an Egyptian scribe, finally heard after centuries of silence. And so, slowly but steadily, the bridge extended. From Greek to Demotic, from Demotic to Coptic, and from Coptic into the sacred hieroglyphs. Champollion could almost see the other side, the moment when the entire system would yield and Egypt would speak again. Rivalries in scholarship can be just as sharp as those on battlefields, and for Jean-François Champollion, the most persistent rival was the English polymath Thomas Young. Young was older, accomplished, and astonishingly versatile. He had already made contributions in physics, optics, and medicine before turning his attention to the Rosetta Stone. To French scholars, he was an intimidating figure. To Champollion, he was both a worthy competitor and a looming obstacle. Imagine Champollion in Paris, hunched over his notes, reading an English publication where Young cautiously announced progress on demotic. Young had managed to identify certain characters as phonetic, particularly within royal names like Ptolemy. This was not a trivial achievement. It showed that demotic was at least partly alphabetic. For Champollion, though, the announcement was like a spark and a slap combined. Inspiration laced with rivalry. Mainstream fact here: Thomas Young published his preliminary findings in 1819, highlighting about 80 demotic signs and their possible phonetic values. He was hesitant, careful, unwilling to overstate. He still believed hieroglyphs were largely symbolic, with phonetics used only for foreign names. Champollion, however, wanted to push the argument much further. If demotic carried sounds, then so did hieroglyphs, and not only for foreign names. The quirky tidbit here: when news of Young's work reached Paris, one French scholar quipped that the Englishman was a man of 1,000 talents and no patience. It was a backhanded compliment. Young spread himself across so many fields that he rarely pursued one problem to its end. Champollion, by contrast, had only one obsession. He lacked Young's breadth, but made up for it with relentless focus. The two men never quite became friends, though they exchanged letters and occasional courtesies. Their rivalry became a proxy for national pride. Britain versus France, the British Museum versus the Parisian salons. Young's measured caution versus Champollion's fiery conviction. Jacques, always protective, stoked his brother's determination. "Do not let the Englishman take Egypt from us." The phrase became a kind of battle cry in the Champollion household. Historians still argue whether Young deserves more credit than he received. Some say his groundwork paved the way for Champollion's breakthrough, that without Young's tables of demotic correspondences, the Frenchman would have floundered longer. Others counter that Champollion's use of Coptic and his leap to a fully phonetic system was an intellectual revolution that went far beyond Young's tentative steps. The debate continues in biographies and academic papers, a ghost duel fought long after both men were gone. For Champollion, the rivalry was personal. He envied Young's prestige and resented the applause Britain showered on him. At the same time, he respected the Englishman's skill. Imagine him late at night, poring over Young's publications, muttering criticisms under his breath, then scribbling furiously in his own notebooks to go further, faster. Rivalry can be corrosive, but it can also be rocket fuel. Quirky anecdote. Once, after hearing an English visitor praise Young's brilliance, Champollion reportedly snapped, "Then let him keep his rain and his fog, and I will keep the Nile." It was a sharp, nationalistic jab, half in jest but rooted in real resentment. For him, Egypt was not just a scholarly prize, it was almost a personal inheritance. The duel extended beyond language. Young, meticulous and scientific, treated decipherment as one problem among many. He tested, recorded, published, and moved on. Champollion, however, lived and breathed it. He poured his health, his youth, and his very identity into the hieroglyphs. Where Young was careful not to overclaim, Champollion was reckless, willing to gamble on bold theories. This difference in temperament made their approaches complementary in hindsight. But, at the time, it made them antagonists. Picture a scene in Paris. A gathering of scholars around a table covered in papers. A heated debate erupts. Someone insists that Young has already done the essential work, that all France can do is refine it. Jean-François, red-cheeked and sharp-tongued, slams his hand on the table and declares, "Young has touched the surface. I will reach the core." The room falls silent for a moment, then murmurs ripple through. Some admire his fire. Others shake their heads at his arrogance. Historians still argue whether national rivalry between Britain and France exaggerated the tension between the two men. Without that backdrop, perhaps they might have been collaborators instead of competitors. But history rarely gives us collaborations across enemy lines, especially in the wake of Napoleonic wars. The decipherment of Egypt's script became entangled in the pride of nations, and each success or failure carried political overtones. And so the race continued, Young, cautious and broad-minded, publishing incremental results in London. Champollion, obsessive and fiery, scribbling Coptic glosses onto hieroglyphs in Paris. Two men on parallel tracks, heading toward the same destination, but traveling at very different speeds. For Champollion, the rivalry was more than a distraction, it was fuel. He burned with the need not only to succeed, but to succeed before Young, to claim Egypt for France, to carve his name deeper into history than any English rival could. And that determination, sharpened by jealousy and pride, would soon push him toward the most dramatic breakthrough of his life. The years of obsession settled over Jean-François Champollion like a heavy cloak, one he never seemed willing to take off. His life in Paris became less about meals, leisure, or social niceties, and more about the endless shuffle between libraries, lecture halls, and his cramped, candlelit study. You can almost hear the rhythm, the rustle of parchment, the scratch of quills, the sighs of frustration, and occasionally the faint, triumphant cry when a new link was discovered. Mainstream fact here. By 1821, Champollion had dedicated nearly a decade, almost exclusively, to Egyptian studies, amassing what was considered one of the most comprehensive Coptic dictionaries in existence. He was not content with fragments. He compiled, categorized, and built systems. His dictionary wasn't just a side tool. It became the backbone of his later decipherment. Scholars today still marvel at its precision for a man working largely in isolation, without the institutional support that Young enjoyed in London. But obsession, while productive, also eroded him. His body was not built for relentless study. Letters from Jacques describe him pale, gaunt, sometimes coughing blood, and often too weak to rise from bed. Jacques urged rest, friends encouraged moderation, but Jean-François shrugged it off. "The hieroglyphs will not wait for my lungs," he once snapped, half joking, but with an edge of fatalism. To him, each wasted day was another chance for rivals to surge ahead. The quirky tidbit here, Champollion had a habit of carrying scraps of papyrus reproductions in his pockets, so that even during walks he could pull them out and scribble new comparisons. One friend recalled how, on a stroll through Paris gardens, he stopped mid-sentence, whipped out a crumpled sheet, and scrawled furiously on the back of a theatre program. Passersby stared, but he didn't notice. Nature, conversation, even beauty itself came second to the puzzle in his head. His nights were particularly brutal. He often worked until dawn, fueled by little more than coffee, bread, and sheer stubbornness. Picture the scene. The small room lit by a single candle, stacks of books teetering on the table, ink stains blotting his sleeves. Outside, the city slowly quiets into sleep. Carriages dwindling, dogs barking less frequently. Inside, the only sounds are the scratch of quills, the turning of pages, and the occasional muttered expletive when a line of hieroglyphs refused to yield sense. Historians still argue whether these years were his most productive or simply his most self-destructive. Some biographers suggest he might have reached the breakthrough sooner if he had taken better care of himself, allowing his mind time to rest and reset. Others counter that only this feverish intensity, this near madness, could have driven him to the brink of discovery. Jacques played nurse, financier, and buffer against the outside world. He begged colleagues for stipends, brought food into the study, and sometimes physically pulled his brother away from the desk. But even Jacques admitted defeat more often than not. He is married to Egypt, Jacques once sighed. There is no room for another wife. During these years, Paris intellectual society often whispered about him. Some admired his devotion. Others mocked him as a crank doomed to waste away in dusty papers. Rivals in London circulated rumors that his health would end his work before any real result emerged. Jean-François, stubborn as ever, ignored the gossip. He believed history belonged to the patient, not the skeptics. Quirky anecdote. Once, after collapsing from exhaustion, he reportedly murmured as Jacques tried to revive him, "Even the pharaohs are tired of waiting." It was both tragic and humorous. The sort of exhausted delirium that comes from too many sleepless nights. And yet, through all the exhaustion, there was progress. He began to recognize recurring names and titles in the hieroglyphic inscriptions. Cross-referencing them with Greek, he compiled lists of cartouches, oval shapes, enclosing royal names and guessed which belonged to which pharaoh. Slowly, the alphabet of sounds took shape in his mind. But each small step only whetted his appetite for the next, and the next. Historians still argue whether he realized, during these years, how close he was. Some suggest he had the essential system already by 1821, but lacked the final push of confidence. Others believe the key insights were still hidden, requiring one dramatic flash of realization. Whichever version you prefer, what cannot be denied is that by the early 1820s, Champollion was teetering on the edge of a breakthrough. Imagine the man at his desk, eyes bloodshot, hair unkempt, hands shaking from fatigue. In front of him, a cartouche gleams in the candlelight, its symbols bold and mysterious. He traces them with his finger, then scribbles possible Coptic equivalents beside them. He pauses, leans back, closes his eyes, and whispers the sounds aloud. For a fleeting moment, it feels like the wall between centuries has thinned. He hears a voice not his own, echoing through the chamber of time. He opens his eyes, heart racing, and scratches down another note. The world outside politics, fashion, gossip fades to irritate. Friends invite him to dinners. Colleagues urge him to publish prematurely. Critics taunt him from afar. He declines, ignores, and retreats. His life narrows to ink, paper, and symbols. And though it is slowly draining his health, it is also slowly filling his notebooks with the scaffolding of the solution that would change history. The moment of breakthrough did not arrive with trumpets or fireworks. It came after years of exhaustion, endless scribbles, and near failure. When Champollion finally assembled enough pieces for the whole puzzle to snap into place. Imagine him in September 1822, pale and weary. hunched over his desk in Paris with a pile of cartouches spread out before him. These little oval frames, enclosing royal names, had become his obsession. He knew that if he could match just a few to their Greek equivalents, the rest of the system would begin to reveal itself. Mainstream fact here. The decisive moment came when Champollion compared to hieroglyphic cartouches, one believed to spell Ptolemaios, Ptolemy, and the other Cleopatra. By aligning the symbols they shared, the P, the L, the O, he confirmed that hieroglyphs did, in fact, carry phonetic values. This was not mere speculation. It was evidence. The hieroglyphs were not only pictures of ideas, but also letters and sounds. That realization cracked the wall wide open. Picture him running his ink-stained fingers along the cartouches, whispering syllables under his breath. P2, La, Mios, Cleo, Pat, Tra. The repeated signs lined up perfectly. For the first time, he could hear the sounds trapped inside the stone. His heart began to race. He quickly grabbed other cartouche names of Ramses, Thutmose, and others and applied the same method. The results matched. The system was consistent. It was not luck. It was language, alive again after 15 centuries of silence. Quirky tidbit. Later accounts suggest that when the realization struck him fully, he leapt up from his chair, scattering papers across the floor, and shouted, "G10's Laffer. I've got it." He then promptly fainted. His brother Jacques rushed in, startled, and found him collapsed on the floor, overcome by exhaustion and exhilaration. When Champollion came to, he reportedly gripped Jacques' hand and whispered, "I am certain." Historians still argue whether this fainting episode was embellished later, polished into a dramatic anecdote by admirers. But even if the details are fuzzy, the essence is true. Champollion's health was fragile, and the emotional shock of the breakthrough was more than his body could easily bear. After years of being ridiculed, doubted, and mocked, the moment of vindication had come, and it nearly crushed him physically. The breakthrough wasn't just about names. Once he proved hieroglyphs could be phonetic, he applied the principle to wider texts. Slowly, words began to form. Sentences emerged from the walls of temples, and the papyri once thought indecipherable. He tested his system on inscriptions from obelisks and sarcophagi, and each time the results aligned with Coptic roots he already knew. The language of the pharaohs had not vanished. It had been waiting. Imagine him pacing the room in feverish excitement, muttering aloud in half Coptic, half French phrases. While Jacques tried to calm him down, he scribbled notes so quickly that the ink sometimes blurred, then tore fresh sheets to keep going. It was like watching a dam burst after decades of pressure. Quirky anecdote. In the first days after his breakthrough, he became so animated that he terrified his students. During one lecture, he suddenly abandoned his planned topic, scrawled hieroglyphs across the blackboard, and began shouting the phonetic values in a voice that shook the room. The students sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing genius or madness. Historians still argue whether his method was flawless from the start. In truth, his first decipherments had errors, misreadings, oversimplifications, occasional leaps of faith. But the essential principle was sound, and over time, he refined it. His 1822 letter to the day inscriptions, Etbel's letters, often called the letter on the alphabet of the hieroglyphs, laid out his system. Some scoffed, others gasped. A century-old mystery had finally cracked open. Picture the sensation in Europe. Scholars rushing to test his claims. Priests in Egypt realizing their ancestral language could be heard again. newspapers trumpeting the triumph of French genius. Britain, naturally, bristled, insisting that Young's contributions had been unfairly minimized. France, equally naturally, rallied behind Champollion as a national hero. The rivalry flared hotter, but for Jean-François, the joy of the moment outweighed the politics. In his private notebooks, he wrote lines that read almost like love letters to Egypt. The hieroglyphs are not mute, they speak. They sing. They tell the story of kings, of gods, of people who have waited centuries to be heard. He was no longer simply a scholar. He had become a bridge between two worlds. And yet, the very intensity that carried him to the breakthrough left him fragile. His fainting fits became more frequent. Jacques fretted constantly. Friends urged him to rest. But Champollion, even after his collapse, kept pushing forward. He had not just solved a puzzle, he had opened a door, and now he wanted to stride through it before time. Or his body shut it again. When Champollion announced his discovery publicly in September 1822, the shockwaves were immediate. Imagine the day inscriptions, E.T. Bell's letters in Paris. A chamber filled with scholars who had argued for decades about whether hieroglyphs could ever be understood. Into this room walks a frail, intense young man, clutching papers covered in his scrawled hieroglyphic tables. His voice trembles at first, then steadies as he lays out his findings. Line by line, he demonstrates how cartouches spell royal names, how the signs correspond to sounds, and how Coptic bridges the gap. By the time he finishes, the room is stunned into silence. Mainstream fact here, Champollion's 1822 presentation, often referred to as the letter R.M. Dessier, was only a preliminary sketch. 2 years later, in 1824, he published a much larger work, the Do, which systematically explained his method. These publications cemented his place as the founder of Egyptology. For the first time in over a millennium, humanity had a functioning key to the language of the pharaohs. The reactions, however, were far from uniform. Many scholars were jubilant. They saw the breakthrough as the dawn of a new science. The ability to read Egypt's own words rather than rely on Greek or Roman commentators. Others were skeptical, muttering that the young Frenchman was too bold, too sure of himself, perhaps even mistaken. And across the Channel, in London, Thomas Young read the announcement with mixed emotions, admiration, frustration, and no small amount of resentment. Historians still argue whether Young's contributions were unfairly overshadowed. In France, Champollion was celebrated as the sole genius who had unlocked the hieroglyphs. In Britain, Young's supporters pointed out that he had identified several phonetic values before Champollion and accused the Frenchman of building on English work without proper acknowledgement. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Young's cautious steps paved the way, but Champollion's leap completed the bridge. The quirky tidbit here, one Paris newspaper, trying to simplify the discovery for the general public, described Champollion as the man who taught the Sphinx to speak. The phrase stuck, and caricatures soon followed, cartoons of sphinxes with wide-open mouths, hieroglyphic birds chattering like sparrows, and even Champollion himself depicted whispering into a mummy's ear. He reportedly laughed at the drawings, though Jacques worried they cheapened the gravity of the achievement. But not all reactions were humorous. Some rival scholars launched fierce critiques, accusing him of overreach. They nitpicked errors in his early readings, seized on ambiguities, and warned that he was deluding himself. In academic journals, his name became a lightning rod. Some issues praised him as a genius, others dismissed him as reckless. For Champollion, these attacks were both painful and motivating. He doubled down, refining his system, producing more evidence, and daring his critics to prove him wrong. Meanwhile, Europe at large was entranced by Egypt. Napoleon's expedition had already ignited a craze. But now, with hieroglyphs becoming readable, the fascination deepened. Imagine salons where aristocrats passed around copies of Champollion's tables, whispering about kings with names like Ramses and Thutmose. Museums arranged Egyptian displays with renewed vigor, confident that labels could soon be translated accurately. Egyptomania spilled into fashion, again furniture carved with hieroglyphs, wallpaper patterned with obelisks, even stage plays dramatizing the lives of pharaohs. Quirky anecdote: a Parisian jeweler advertised authentic hieroglyphic rings, claiming they bore magical powers. When Champollion examined them, he snorted. They spelled nothing but nonsense. Still, he admitted they were charming trinkets, and he bought one for his niece. The scholarly community, however, was less frivolous. Debates raged at conferences, correspondents flew between Paris, London, and Berlin, and libraries filled with heated marginalia in the margins of Champollion's publications. Some tried to refine his system, others tried to undermine it, and still others simply basked in the excitement. The decipherment of Egyptian writing was not just an intellectual achievement, it was a cultural event, reshaping how Europe imagined antiquity. Historians still argue whether Champollion fully realized, in those early years, the magnitude of what he had done. He seemed both exhilarated and overwhelmed. On one hand, he was proud, triumphant, even boastful at times. On the other, he was haunted by the sheer scale of the task ahead. Deciphering a few names was one thing. Reconstructing an entire civilization's language was another. He wrote to Jacques, "I have opened the door, but the palace is vast, and I am only at the threshold." Picture him walking through the streets of Paris, frail but radiant, while strangers whispered his name. Some tipped their hats in admiration. Others rolled their eyes, muttering that he was just the latest in a long line of eccentric savants. He ignored both praise and criticism. His thoughts were already racing ahead toward the monuments of Egypt themselves. He longed to stand before them, to test his system against inscriptions on temples and tombs, to hear the voices of the Nile not through copies and sketches, but in their original stone. The Rosetta Stone had given him a key. Now he wanted to use it on the doors of Egypt itself. For years, Egypt had been a dream, glimpsed only through books, engravings, and copies of inscriptions. But in 1828, that dream solidified into reality when Jean-François Champollion finally set foot on the banks of the Nile. After his public triumph in Paris, he secured support for an expedition, co-led with the Tuscan scholar Ippolito Rossellini. The mission was part scientific, part national pride, and part personal pilgrimage. For Champollion, it was more than an academic venture, was the chance to test his life as work against the living stone of Egypt itself. Mainstream fact here: the Franco-Tuscan expedition, 1828 to 1829, was the first modern scientific mission to Egypt and Nubia, involving nearly 40 scholars, artists, and assistants. Their goal was to copy, record, and interpret monuments across the Nile Valley. Champollion, though frail in health, was the intellectual leader. He directed which sites to study, which inscriptions to trace, and how to catalogue the results. Imagine him stepping off a boat into the hot Egyptian sunlight for the first time. The air thick with dust, the river glittering, the horizon broken by palms and distant ruins. He shades his eyes, stares at the silhouette of an obelisk, and feels his heart hammer in his chest. For decades, he has studied these forms in ink on paper. Now the hieroglyphs are towering above him, carved deep into stone, gleaming against the sky. He reaches out, places his fingers in the grooves of a hieroglyphic bird, and whispers, almost reverently, "You speak." Quirky tidbit. Local guides nicknamed him the Man of Letters because of his obsession with copying inscriptions. They watched him climb scaffolds or crouch in dust for hours, muttering Coptic words under his breath, completely oblivious to the blazing heat. Some joked that he would melt into the hieroglyphs if he stayed too long. The expedition was grueling. Travel along the Nile in the 1820s was no luxury cruise. Boats leaked, food spoiled, and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds at night. Yet Champollion pressed forward, often ignoring his own worsening health. Jacques had begged him not to go, fearing the harsh climate would kill him, but Champollion insisted. "If I die in Egypt, it will be among friends." His meaning was clear. The pharaohs were his companions now, and their voices mattered more than his lungs. Historians still argue whether the expedition advanced scholarship more through documentation or through confirmation of Champollion's system. What is undeniable is the sheer scope of the work. Teams sketched and copied inscriptions at Thebes, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, and Abu Simbel. Artists traced entire walls, filling rolls of paper with hieroglyphic scenes. Champollion supervised tirelessly, checking every line against his growing mental dictionary. For him, each symbol traced on site was proof that his phonetic system worked in practice, not just in theory. At Thebes, he entered vast hypostyle halls where columns soared like stone forests. The hieroglyphs climbed their surfaces like ivy, dense and majestic. He pressed his hand against one, tilted his head back, and whispered aloud the names of pharaohs Ramesses, Seti, Thutmose, names that had not been spoken in their true form for over 1,000 years. One companion later recalled that tears streamed down his cheeks as he muttered, "I am reading the words of the Egyptians themselves." Quirky anecdote. Champollion had a childlike joy when he first read the cartouches on temple walls. At Abu Simbel, he reportedly clapped his hands like an excited schoolboy, shouting, "Ramses, Ramses," to the bewilderment of local workers. They laughed and repeated the name after him, turning the solemn ruins into an impromptu chorus of voices calling out to a long-dead king. But joy was tempered by hardship. The climate battered him. The desert heat cracked his skin, the Nile's humidity drained his strength, and his lungs, already fragile, wheezed under the strain. He suffered frequent fevers, sometimes collapsing in the middle of work. Yet, even when bedridden, he demanded inscriptions be brought to him, traced on paper so he could continue analyzing them. The obsession never slackened. Historians still argue whether his insistence on leading the expedition, despite his poor health, shortened his life. Some biographers view it as heroic sacrifice. Others call it reckless self-destruction. But for Champollion, the question never existed. He was in Egypt, hearing the stones speak, and that was all that mattered. The Franco-Tuscan expedition eventually amassed thousands of copies, drawings, and notes, filling crates that would later enrich European museums. For the wider world, it was a treasure trove. For Champollion, it was vindication. Every cartouche, every inscription confirmed his system. Hieroglyphs were not mystical symbols, they were language. As alive and precise as Latin or Greek. Imagine him one evening on the deck of a boat, drifting on the Nile under a canopy of stars. The desert air is cool, the river dark and silent. He leans on the railing, coughing softly, clutching a notebook filled with sketches from the day. He gazes at the horizon, where the silhouette of a temple looms faintly, and whispers, "I have spoken with you." He feels both triumphant and utterly spent. The Nile had given him what he longed for: proof, intimacy, communion. But it also drained what little strength he had left. When he finally sailed away from Egypt in 1829, carrying crates of knowledge, he was already a man aged beyond his years, his health broken by the land he loved most. By the time Champollion returned from Egypt in 1829, he was both triumphant and visibly broken. The Franco-Tuscan expedition had given him the proof he craved. The hieroglyphs worked exactly as he had argued. His system stood strong against the temples, the tombs, and the obelisks of the Nile. Yet Egypt had also taken its toll. He came back gaunt, with a chronic cough, weakened lungs, and the pale, hollow-eyed look of a man who had pushed his body too far for too long. Mainstream fact here: in 1831, despite his failing health, Champollion was appointed to the newly created chair of Egyptian antiquities at the De France. It was the first professorship of Egyptology in the world. For a boy once mocked as eccentric in Figuiac, it was the ultimate vindication. His obsession had become an institution. He delivered lectures where, for the first time, Egyptian words were explained to students systematically, as if they were Latin or Greek. But every lecture drained him. Colleagues noted how he gripped the podium for support, his voice sometimes breaking into a cough mid-sentence. Still, when he began to trace hieroglyphs on the chalkboard, his eyes lit up, his voice grew animated, and the old fire returned. Students described being spellbound, even if they didn't grasp every technical detail. It was less a class than a performance, a frail prophet translating voices from the stones of Egypt. Quirky tidbit: in his final years, he insisted on decorating his study with small Egyptian artifacts and reproductions, so that even in Paris he felt surrounded by his beloved Nile. One visitor joked that stepping into his study was like entering a temple, only with ink bottles instead of incense. Champollion chuckled, admitting it was the closest he could come to living among the pharaohs again. Meanwhile, his pen kept working. He drafted grammar guides, dictionaries, and translations, racing against time. He knew his health was fading, but he refused to slow down. Jacques begged him to rest. Friends urged moderation, but he would reply, "I have been entrusted with Egypt's voice. I cannot stop until I have given it back to the world." Historians still argue whether his last years were more productive or more tragic. Some celebrate the flood of manuscripts he left behind, evidence of a mind still sharp despite a failing body. Others mourn that he never had the time to polish his discoveries, leaving much unfinished. Either way, his study became both workshop and sick room, a place where coughing fits punctuated the sound of quills scratching across paper. By 1832, his health collapsed entirely. He grew weaker, often confined to bed, though he continued to dictate notes when he could no longer hold a pen steadily. Jacques sat at his side, writing down every whispered phrase, determined to preserve his brother's last thoughts. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit room in Paris, windows shuttered against the noise of the street. Jean-François, lying pale and feverish, still murmuring about verb conjugations and cartouches, while Jacques, eyes wet, scribbles as fast as he can. Quirky anecdote. In one of his final lectures, sensing how frail he had become, Champollion reportedly told his students, "If you ever see me fall silent, remember it's only because the Egyptians are speaking louder." The students laughed softly, but the words carried a chilling truth. On March 4, 1832, at just 41 years old, Jean-François Champollion died in Paris. His health had never recovered from the Egyptian climate, and the years of overwork had drained what little strength remained. Jacques was devastated, mourning not only a brother, but also the man whose brilliance he had nurtured from childhood. Historians still argue whether Champollion knew, in those last days, how deeply he had changed history. Some say he died with doubts, worrying that his work was incomplete. Others believe he passed with quiet confidence, having given the world its first true key to Egypt. His grave, fittingly, bore an inscription in hieroglyphs, a final testament to the language he had resurrected. And so his story closed. Not with a grand procession or public monument, but in a quiet Parisian room, where ink-stained pages lay scattered around a man who had devoted his short life to hearing the voices of the Nile. Egypt had spoken through him, but the cost was his years, his health, and ultimately his life. When Jean-François Champollion died in 1832, he left behind more than unfinished manuscripts and weary notebooks. He left a legacy carved into the intellectual bedrock of Europe, a legacy that reshaped the way the world understood one of its oldest civilizations. In a single lifetime, cut tragically short, he had taken the silent walls of Egypt and given them back their voices. His name became permanently entwined with the Rosetta Stone, not just as a scholar who studied it, but as the man who finally unlocked its secrets. Mainstream fact here: the discipline of Egyptology, as a formal academic field, essentially begins with Champollion. Before him, Egypt was a land of myths and half-guesses, its monuments admired but not understood. After him, inscriptions could be read, histories reconstructed, and dynasties named. The temples of Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel were no longer mute stone. They became archives of human experience. Without his phonetic decipherment, none of this would have been possible. But his legacy was not only academic, it was cultural. Europe's fascination with Egypt had long been tinged with exoticism, and fantasy pyramids as mystical symbols, mummies as party curiosities, hieroglyphs as decorative motifs on wallpaper and teacups. After Champollion, Egypt took on depth and voice. The pharaohs were not just caricatures in Greek texts, but real rulers with names, laws, triumphs, and tragedies preserved in their own words. Quirky tidbit: within a generation of his death, Parisian schoolchildren were taught to say Champollion as synonymous with decipherment. Some even nicknamed him La the Undecipherer, turning his surname into a playful verb. Imagine children on playgrounds pretending to Champollion secret codes scrawled in chalk. It was a cultural shorthand for cracking mysteries. Of course, debates about credit never vanished. Thomas Young's defenders continued to argue that the English polymath had paved the way. Historians still argue whether Champollion owed more to Young's groundwork than he admitted. But while the scholarly tug-of-war persisted, the popular imagination firmly gave the crown to Champollion. He was the fiery prodigy, the fainting visionary, the man who made the Sphinx speak. His name lives on not just in books, but in monuments. In his hometown of Figik, a giant reproduction of the Rosetta Stone now lies in the town square, honoring the boy who once scribbled alphabets in the margins of his schoolbooks. Streets in Paris and Grenoble bear his name. His manuscripts, preserved in libraries, still astonish researchers with their density of detail. Historians still argue whether his early death robbed the field of decades of further discoveries. Some say that had he lived longer, Egyptology would have advanced twice as quickly. Others suggest that his foundational work was so decisive that the rest was inevitable. He had already given the world the key, and others could follow. Either way, the poignancy remains. 41 years of life, centuries of impact. Picture him in memory. A pale, ink-stained figure hunched over candlelight, muttering Coptic syllables, dreaming of temples he had not yet seen. Picture him years later, standing before those temples, tears on his cheeks, whispering names once lost to time. And picture him finally at rest, his grave marked by hieroglyphs, as if Egypt itself had come to keep vigil. Legacy is often a messy thing, tangled with rivalry, myth, and national pride. But in the quiet hours, when a scholar somewhere traces a line of hieroglyphs and sounds out the syllables of a word unseen for 2,000 years, Champollion's presence lingers. He is there in every translation, every classroom, every museum label explaining that the bird is not just a bird, but a sound, a letter, a voice reborn. The restless boy from Figik, the prodigy from Grenoble, the obsessive from Paris, he did not simply crack a code. He resurrected a language. And in doing so, he reminded the world that silence is never final. That even stone can speak if you are stubborn enough to listen. And now, as we reach the end of this long, winding story, let's slow the pace together. Imagine yourself back in that dim study in Figik, where a young boy once traced letters by candlelight. The lamp glows faintly, the air is still, and outside the night presses softly against the windows. The frantic scribbling of pens and the heated rivalries of scholars fade away, leaving only the quiet comfort of words on a page. The Nile, the temples, the Rosetta Stone itself, all of it grows hazy, like a dream slipping into the distance. What remains is something gentle. The image of a man who listened hard enough to hear voices long forgotten. His journey reminds us that persistence has its own kind of calm rhythm, like the steady lapping of water against a boat, or the unhurried breathing of someone finally falling asleep. Let yourself drift with that rhythm. Picture hieroglyphs not as riddles, but as patterns, soft shapes carved in stone, repeating like a lullaby. An owl, a ripple of water, a shining sun, discord arranged not as puzzles, but as quiet decorations on the walls of memory. They no longer demand your attention. They simply float before your eyes, harmless and serene. You've walked through battles of scholarship, nights of obsession, triumphs and fevers. But now all of that resolves into silence. The voices of Egypt whisper only faintly, as if inviting you not to study them, but to rest with them. Breathe slowly. Feel your body sink deeper into comfort. The story has spoken, and now it grows quiet. So close your eyes, let the images dissolve, and drift with the soft hum of sleep.